afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate your time. Today we are going over using access data with Dana Gastick-French from Upriver Education, who has a lot of excellent experience and knowledge to share with you all. My name is Elizabeth Dion from Demonstrated Success, and we work with and for the DOE as well to offer you these trainings. Wanted to just go over a few things with you before we start. I'm sorry for the redundancy, but just want to make sure we get to it all. One is please keep yourself on mute while she's presenting, just so we don't get that background noise and distraction that can often happen, all unintentionally, but we appreciate it. Feel free to unmute yourself to have a conversation when that time allows. I want to remind you all, you will receive an email from me tomorrow night, not tomorrow morning, tomorrow night, with the slides and your professional development certificate. Sometimes it takes a little bit more than a day to get the video uploaded to our YouTube channel, and I like to put that link in my follow-up email. That's why it takes a day for you to get that. But you will receive it. And if you have any questions or problems with it, please let me know. We really, really encourage your participation and appreciate it. So please use the chat feature for questions for now. If there's something that you have that's helpful to everybody, please put that in the chat so that people can see that and gain from your experience and knowledge as well. And also at the very end of the webinar, I have just a 1-minute survey for you to complete. I put the link in the chat section. I will repeat that link again at the end of the webinar, and we really value your input. So if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to fill that out, that would be super. So we are very happy to have you with us here today, and I'm going to let Dana get this started for us. Thanks so much.
All right, super. Thanks, Beth, for that introduction. Once again, I am Dana Gastick-French, and I'm the lead consultant for Upriver Education, which is a firm that specializes in maximizing outcomes for multilingual learners and the educators who serve them, such as yourselves. So we're here as a partner with Demonstrated Success, and so glad to be here to discuss access for ELLS. So without further ado, so our agenda for today is here. So we're going to welcome one another in a moment with just like a little brief icebreaker and introduce ourselves briefly. And then we're going to talk about how to read these access reports. We've got a lot of information that comes out, and I really want to share with you what that looks like, what the pieces of these reports mean, and then what does this data mean about what our students can do? And of course, how does that impact you in the classroom, and how can we leverage this information as classroom teachers? So that's where we're going to go today. All right, so Beth has already given us a nice welcome, and I just want to once again say thank you for being here. And as Beth mentioned, if you have questions that come up as we are having these discussions, please feel free to put them right in the chat. Beth is going to be monitoring that chat. So, you know, I'm happy to kind of have her interrupt me and answer that as it comes into your mind. Certainly that doesn't bother me at all. And if we're going to get to it later on, I'll just let you know that. And then if you, we will be going into breakout rooms a couple of times. And if you want to have your cameras on at that time, if that's possible, that would be a great way to kind of meet your colleagues and work together in those moments. If that's not possible, we certainly understand that as well. All right, and then finally, I encourage you to apply a real growth mindset for yourself in this work. Have patience. There may be a lot of new information. Sometimes this stuff feels like a lot because it is a lot, but in time, it will incubate and you'll be able to make a step towards application of this knowledge into practice. But let's first start by recognizing it, right? We'll move up blooms in time. Okay, so what I'd like to know in the chat to find out about you today is, let us know, number one, where you're zooming in from, what district or area do you represent? And then I'd like you to self-assess here a little bit and rate your access knowledge. So on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being what is access? And 5 being, I could facilitate this session with you, Dana. Where would you put yourself? And no shame in this, just kind of a little read the room from me. So go ahead and throw that in the chat. Right, so we have, where's SAU 82? Chester, great, and we have Manchester, 5, great, some really familiar folks up here. 3s, SAU 54, wonderful. Terrific, so we have a great representation, people, and it sounds like you all have some pretty solid knowledge to get started with today. So hopefully what that means is when we do our activities, we can really kind of dig in a little bit and try to get more towards application, or just reiterate some of these pieces for you so that when your data do come out, you'll be ready to utilize those. So thank you. All right. So today's objectives, we'll start here. First is that you will be able to interpret access reports. So this is, we're really going to basically be going over focusing mainly on the individual score report for students and look at a sample so you can build familiarity with this report before your personal student data arrives in May. And then we're going to seek to have you be able to explain how access data can be used to design effective instruction for multilingual learners. And I want you to notice that this goal does not say you will apply access data to instruction. I really think it's important that we scaffold our learning, and let's build up to that and focus today on really understanding how these data can be useful to you and your students, and then start building that into practice. So some guiding questions, all right? One of the things I'd like you to do is have a notebook on hand. So if you could grab a notebook, a pen, a piece of paper, something, we're gonna take a minute to do just a little personal journaling. And so we have 2 questions, guiding questions here that we'll revisit later. The first question is, what role does language play in my classroom, right? And then the second question is, how can understanding the pathway to learning English help me to reach my English learners? And if you don't quite have an answer yet, that's okay, we will revisit, but take a moment to write some thoughts down personally about these 2 questions.
We just had someone join us, so thank you for joining us. And just so you're caught up with us, we've just started, and just asking you to write down, what role does language play in my classroom, and how can understanding the pathway to learning English help me to reach my English learners? And we'll share that shortly. Thanks.
Great, so let's come together, and I'd love to hear from any of you who'd be willing to share some thoughts. If anyone wants to come off mute to talk about what came into their mind, or put some piece of their response in the chat, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think? What role does language play in your classroom?
Feel free to unmute. We'd love your input.
You brave souls out there.
I feel it's critical to all aspects of the classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we can't quite get to our content without it, right? I had one teacher in a recent session say that she described the language as a vehicle to her content. And I thought that was really a great way to look at it. It just really says it so nicely. You know, there is no content area that is language free. We used to think of mathematics as sort of the language neutral content area, but you know, that even has a lot of assumptions built into it, right? There's a lot of prepositions in math. There are a lot of multi meaning words, right? A table in math is not necessarily the same as a table in science or, you know, in preschool, right? Just the actual furniture. So there's so many pieces, and then it just gets more and more complex. But yeah, that's a great point. It really is, it is everything. Any thoughts on how understanding this pathway to sort of what this natural trajectory of language acquisition looks like can help you reach your students?
Good questions. Someone wrote and just said, you know, it really sets the tone for your class as well.
Yeah, that's great. It does set the tone. And I think, you know, this piece is a little more complex and will come in time. But just knowing and understanding that there's a research progression to how we learn language over time, right? I love to say that academic language is nobody's first language. And that although like knowing these pieces is essential for multilingual learners, it is certainly beneficial for all of our students, right? I think we live in an increasingly informal world, right? With texting and, you know, all of this language that has become almost shorthand. And then we go to school and we have this higher register of academic language. So one of the tools we'll see through WIDA is that it actually breaks down what's next in academic language, which could be useful really for all of your students. And I think, you know, Leanne, I see you're talking about scaffolding, which is really just that, right? Like what really supporting until so we can grow them into the next level. So that's terrific. All right, we're going to revisit these questions at some point. So thank you for sharing. And let's move on to our next slide. So what is Access for ELLS? A lot of times you'll hear this referred to as the WIDA test, right? You may have heard that because WIDA are the overarching English language development standards that the Access for ELLS test is based upon. And these are standards that identify language for, and that's a really intentional word, right? It's the language we use for science, the language you use for social studies, for mathematics, for language arts, and then for social and instructional purposes. It's not just the language of, you know, those sort of bold words in the textbook, that tier 3, you know, photosynthesis, let's say, for example, but those academic language features that cross content areas, but are really necessary to understanding content and for demonstrating a student's understanding. So WIDA is this umbrella of standards. And then in order to test students' progress towards these standards, and each year, we give them Access for ELLS assessment. So how many of you have participated in delivering Access and are just wrapping that up this week? Yes. Yeah. So we have a knowing crowd here, it seems, today. So yeah, what a week, right? And you're almost there. And so, yeah, so these standards will give us a hint towards a student's progression towards attainment of what we call English proficiency. And I think that one of the nicest part about WIDA is that it's part of a multi-state consortium. So here's a map of all the states and territories that participate. So WIDA originated in Wisconsin. It was actually a 4-state consortia. And the original acronym was Wisconsin, Illinois, Delaware, and Arkansas. And then lots of others joined. So they kind of shoehorned a new I think world-class instructional design and assessment is the new what WIDA stands for, because so many other states joined. But what's really nice about this is that if you have a student transferring from another state that is part of the WIDA consortium, their data will come with them, hopefully, and you will be able to have that kind of continuity of learning, of care, so to speak. And then when we do get the access for results, of course, they are the students are given proficiency levels in their simplest form, which include levels 1 through 6. A student at a level 1 who is entering could be at the very beginning of their English learning journey or slightly into it. So there's a bit of a range between each of these proficiency levels, and there is no level 0. So I would be a level 1 in Japanese right now, right? Because I have no experience with it, but it may take me some time to get to level 2 and a lot of learning within that proficiency band. At a level 6, we're really talking about students who are very much like their native language speaking peers in terms of their ability to access the instructional language and their instruction in English. So moving along, we're going to talk about reading access reports. Let's take a look at the reports that you're likely to come across at the classroom, and then we'll touch slightly at the district levels. The first report, and the report we're going to focus on mostly today, is the individual score report, which is really most useful for classroom teachers. I have a sample that we're going to dive into shortly to look closely at, but let's just preview some components as a little primer before we get into that sample. So here you can see, so each student and their family will receive this kind of one pager without these call out bubbles that sort of identify their components. And this report is really great for student to teacher conversations, teacher to parent conversations, counselor to parent conversations, when we have tier or intervention meetings, planning for goals for a student, planning for differentiation, language objectives, and those pieces. So it's that individual student level that really helps us kind of know our students deeply. This report's going to include our basic student information here at the top, and then the scores presented in several ways that will break down. At the bottom, there's always a little bit of guidance on what the students generally can do at the levels that they've been assigned according to the test. Now, as many of you are already aware, in New Hampshire, the access testing window is about a month, and it just wrapped up here in March. And those score reports come out in May. So it's a little offset from the school year. Those reports can be used as well for exit decisions to determine if a student is still considered English learner, or if they're not, to reclassify them as former English learner. And what's really nice is that the management system, WIDA AMS, provides these reports in so many languages, and they're consistently adding to these, but it'll be in the same format so that families can receive these in the language requested on their home language survey. All right, so let's dig a little bit into these domain scores. So can anyone call out for me the domains of language? I think this will be like a home run for this group.
I couldn't quite hear the question, Dana.
Sure. Can you tell me the 4 domains of language?
Listening, speaking, reading, and writing.
There you go. She even said them in like the order that we always say them in, right? I can't say them in any other order, I think, because that's how they're always presented. Yeah, so listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So we can consider access really 4 subtests, right? Rather than kind of one full test, because these subtests do occur separately, and they do yield separate scores. So that proficiency level score really is going to help you get a sense of relative strengths and areas of growth, and that can really help in leveraging classroom instruction. So this student, for example, here you can see his or her, I'm not sure actually, relative strength is in reading. So this student appears to be a lot more comfortable taking in language or in receptive language than producing language. So when you're looking for safe ways to communicate, we know that if they're reading, that might be used to support a speaking task or a writing task. And the listening piece is strong, and so we just need to develop that productive end of the oral language, which is the speaking. You will also see scale scores. We'll get into the difference between proficiency level and scale scores in a moment, but just know that the scale scores are used to determine the proficiency level score. It's not normative in that it's not comparing students to one another, but it is taking in information about the student's grade level. So if they're in a grade 2 to 3 testing band, for example, it's going to interpret that same scale score differently for a 3rd grader than a 2nd grader, because the presumption is that they have developmentally more language and that they've had more academic exposure. And if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to hop in. And here's just a reminder of those WIDA proficiency level scores. I don't know what happened to my level 2 here, but emerging is level 2. I lost that right here. Okay. All right, so when we have proficiency level scores, this is our 1 through 6. And that, if you recall from the report, oftentimes have a decimal after them. So it might be a 1.7, right? And so that decimal represents that growth within that proficiency level. So a student who's at a 1.7, for example, is going to have a lot more English than a student at a 1.2 or a 1.0. And so oftentimes we see, oh, they're a level 3, and it feels like they stay there. And I use level 3 for a reason. And if you work with English learners, that it takes a while, right? I feel like that band should be wider than the rest of them. Like 1 kind of tends to happen really quickly because early acquisition is like that. But at a level 3, oftentimes they slow down because the language becomes more complex, especially as that discourse level, or what you produce with language is more of an option, frankly. It's more possible when you have more language. There's just more demand. But the proficiency level scores, so that 1 through 6, is a really great way to compare domains. Just like we did earlier in that report, we can say, relatively, this student is stronger in reading than they are in speaking. So I'm going to focus on bringing up that speaking. I'm going to build confidence with the reading, and you can compare across domains. Now, when we look at scale scores, the scale scores we don't want to compare across domains because they are interpreted into a proficiency score. And so a student with a scale score in this example of 355 in listening is not the same as 355 in speaking. They're very domain specific, and they do a lot of back end analyses and mathematics to figure out what the proficiency level translation is. Now, what the scale score is helpful for is comparing a student's growth over time, right? So if you want to monitor how much growth in reading a student has made over the years, you can follow that scale score. And in fact, it's sometimes been the case where a student has jumped from 1 grade level cluster, right? So maybe they're in a 2-3 band, and then they go into the 4th grade, and their proficiency level appears to have flatlined or gone down, but their scale score has gone up. So what that means is they've made growth in that domain, but against their grade level and their development, they may not be out of that proficiency level band because they've developed more language over that time.
Dana, can I interrupt for a minute?
Of course.
Question, just a little more depth on, are the scores weighted by the tier? For example, will a tier on a speaking or writing test automatically yield a lower score than a tier? What does BC test mean? Natalie, I'm sorry. Do you want to?
No, I know what Natalie's asking.
Oh, you know what that means?
Natalie.
Okay, I'm not familiar with this stuff, Natalie. Dana is the expert. I'm just the facilitator. So thank you, Dana.
Yeah, this is a really great question because when students, so one of the things we haven't addressed is that, right, when students take the access scores, the access test rather, they start with the listening and the reading domains, right? And every student is going to take the same test for that. And then the test will actually put them in a tier. And I'm talking to the online test because that's the majority test that we take. There are some paper versions that we use for kindergarten or alternative testing that look a little differently and are tiered by teachers. But for the online test, it's going to give them a tier. Now, if a student is a newcomer, they will take the tier A or pre-A for speaking and the tier A for writing. And I would have to look it up on the top of my head. If anyone else knows, you can tell me, but the tier A will not let a student score above, I want to say, a level 2, because it maxes them out. If they take a tier, if they're in a tier B, C, they can score at a higher level, right? So it's not that they can't score it, it's just that the test is capped, right? So for a tier A, if you get a tier report, right? So after your students take the listening and reading test, you can run a report and see where they tiered. You will know if your student can exit as an English learner, right? By the fact if they're tiering as an A, they're not going to be able to achieve a score that's in the range of a 3 or a 4. You know, and certainly not the score required to reclassify or exit English learner services. It's also helpful when we get into the group score reports, we'll see that list of tiers to know if the student even had the option of scoring higher. I think a lot of times you'll see a tier A student whose score is like at a 2.0, and you realize that maybe they could have done better, but they really maxed out what the test provided them. Does that answer your question?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it was a student who just blew off the test and just clicked through and should have scored into BC, but he scored into tier A because he just clicked random answers.
And that's so frustrating too. We see that a lot because they go through, and I think this is where those conversations with students, especially if they have agency right around their learning, can be important, although sometimes it doesn't change it. They don't realize that they are thwarting their own ability to reclassify or show really what they can do on future subtests. Yeah, that's hard when you work so hard too. So the last piece I want to talk about on this individual score report, and these pieces exist on all score reports, but this is just a nice way to look at it, are the composite scores. So oftentimes we will say, oh, that student is a level 3 English learner. And that is a really general way to say their overall score. So let's look at this student. Their overall score is a 3.4. That's a general way to say they're kind of in the middle, right, of their trajectory towards attaining English proficiency. However, a little word of caution here is the overall score is an average and not a perfect even average. It actually weights the reading and the writing scores differentially. They're at 35%, and then the listening and the speaking, the oral scores are at 15%. And that's just because of the nature of needing those literacy pieces in English in order to be successful in an English classroom. But that 3.4 average could have been arrived at with very different domain scores. And so really understanding that breakdown is something that I encourage you to do. But it's a good way to have, you know, a real general look at students. They also produce an oral language score, which is just the listening and speaking, and a literacy and comprehension scores. So you can compare that.
We have another question. It says, now that the exit criteria is only a composite, should we be concerned that students are not proficient, even if they move to monitor status?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think because the composite weights the literacy scores, you can trust that they're the dominant scores that will help them arrive at that composite. They can't have very, very low literacy reading and writing scores and reach that composite. And the other piece I want you to remember is that that score is guidance and should be considered in a language assessment team decision that considers the student's other readiness for the general education without ESOL support.
Thank you, Dana. I think we just automatically move students to monitor status when they reach that composite.
Yeah.
So It's
I
not
know,
it,
and it
but-
sometimes, yeah, and then, you know, is your monitoring process really taking into account whether or not they're succeeding and bringing them, are you ever bringing students back in?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of times we have to really look at why these compliance pieces are there, and then and this isn't necessary. Sometimes this is administrative decision. Sometimes, you know, it's just a matter of you know, the ability to have the staff to do this, but really taking a look in earnest at whether or not a student is succeeding when they are exited.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and I'm also wondering because like a lot of our students come into high school having just reached proficiency at the end of middle school, and then they get to high school, and the literacy and language needs in high school are so much harder that, you know, if they are reaching proficiency at the middle school level, they're not ready for that high school language.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific conversation to bring up because they're actually, you know, hitting a new testing band there, right? In a new a grade level cluster. So that proficiency level the next year might actually go down, even if their language ability stayed the same. So if they're right on that cusp and not securely in that range, I would really look at other data and maybe hold them if that's a possibility. Yeah, great questions. All right, so we're going to take a really short time. We're going to go into breakout rooms here. Beth is going to put you in these rooms in just a moment. But first, let me walk through this. So everyone, Beth has linked in the chat a lot of stuff. We have individual student report that we're going to use for this activity. You should also have an activity sheet for this webinar. Beth, do you know if everyone has access to that?
The activity sheet?
Yeah.
I just put in the WIDA report and the can-do descriptor.
I'm going to put it right in here. So if you all can click on this, this is going to break down any activity we do today, and it has all your links too. So you can just kind of quickly link those and you can reference it later if you want to quickly find any of these pieces. But what we'll do for 5 minutes in your breakout rooms, I want you to click on this sample report. And this is a sample report of a student, a 6th grade student named Maria. Read through the report and all its elements. And then really you're just going to answer simply, what can you tell us about Maria based on this report? And then for extra credit, if you'd like it, what can you not tell about Maria from looking at this report, right? Like, what is not safe to assume here? And if you can identify one person from your group to sort of come back and share that information, I would be most appreciative. So Beth, go right ahead. Post your groups and we'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay. Pause the recording.
I found that report kind of confusing. We found it really confusing, actually.
Did you? Tell me more.
Well, it seemed strange that her writing skills were as high as they were, but her reading skills were not.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that happen? That's unusual to see.
Yeah, I find it curious. This is the sample that WIDA chose, but maybe that's just to keep us on our toes to say like no student is the same, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and what might have led to that? I mean, I think that really can bring in a lot of interesting conversation.
Yeah. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's possible that that her, I don't know. It's hard to say. And I'm a reading teacher, so it's really, this is a surprise on the report, actually.
Yeah.
We were surprised
anyone
too.
have any thoughts? Go ahead. What were you surprised about?
Because for the writing portion of the access in 6th grade online, you have to be able to listen to the prompt or read the prompt. So if she has very low listening and reading scores, how was she able to get a 3 in writing? We thought maybe she just knew a word and it got her points. But confused.
Yeah, or on the listening, the day of the listening test, something was happening with her. That's always a possibility too, right? And what I noticed too in this report is that the confidence band is really wide on the listening score. I don't know if you've ever looked at these, but I find them interesting. Like they're pretty secure that she is a 3 in writing, right? Like I think that that's supposed to give you the range of having a really good day and having a really bad day, you know, and where the possible scores could fall. But her range is really wide on that listening. So maybe she did have a bad day, you know, and she's at the bottom end of that range. Yeah, so maybe she does have listening skills. It's really curious. And this is where, and we'll touch briefly on it in a little bit, where, you know, those rubrics that can be used to look at for progress monitoring, where teachers can actually assess student samples, can be really helpful to sort of compare against this one day, right? And I think we have to remember that. I often tell teachers I work with, like, this is one day, it's one point of data. And I'm sure you all feel the same, because you know your students so well. And it is a good indication of what happens on a test, but it might not be what they can do in a more comfortable environment or with supports that may not be in place during this testing session. I like access data for the larger group, as I feel like that information is a little bit more useful, because it's such a quick capture. So one of the pieces here, and I'm just going to move us along because I cannot believe how quickly time flies on these things, especially when you're delivering the information, but is this student roster report, which you're also, you know, that you received both in the print format and as well as online. And these are just other ways districts can use the data to help look at programming and look at trends, right? Where are the students, as Natalie talked about tiering, you know, most of these students are tiering at a tier A, right? And that's gleaned from the listening and reading tests. So does that follow, right? Is this a newcomer program? That would make a lot of sense. It is, you know, a grade level 1, so they do tier lower in the primary grades. But we can look at that in terms of grouping students for ELL classes, or for other groups or placement decisions. And then we can also look at patterns here, right? Because this is really like a panned out version, or look at how we might want to group students for classroom support. And then there's the school frequency report, and this we can run by school, we can run by, it's available for state level, for district level as well. And so it's nice to compare against the state and see, you know, how we're doing in terms of percentages of how students fall. All right, and so what does this access mean about what students can do is really the next question. And I like to point out, of course, this is a measure of English proficiency, which we know, right? It does not, however, measure students' academic achievement or their content knowledge. We are testing the language for content areas, but any information they need is provided in the test. So readiness to perform ordinary classroom work in English does not necessarily mean academic at grade level. And if you're teaching ESOL, I'm sure you understand that, but that's something that is a conversation that I think needs to happen very often with your mainstream colleagues. Access scores can help evaluate programs, right? And say, you know what, are we really focusing enough on oral language? Are we doing enough with literacy? What pieces, what domains are happening? But they really are not a good measure of what individual educators are doing, because it is that one day snapshot. And then, of course, as we talked about earlier, right, with Sherry, like these inform reclassification decisions. And I chose that word inform really intentionally, because they may not be the be all and end all for a student, for a measure of student success moving into the mainstream. All right, so when we ask about what access scores tell us, the first thing we need to think about is what students can do. So WIDA has put out recently their English language development frameworks standards framework update for 2020, which dives very deeply into a lot. But one of the things they have always done, but really put more prominently, is their can-do philosophy, which says, and I rarely read a slide completely, but I think this merits reading. At WIDA, we believe that everyone brings valuable resources to the education community. Linguistically and culturally diverse learners in particular bring a unique set of assets that have the potential to enrich the experiences of all learners and educators. As these young children and students learn additional languages, educators can draw on these assets for the benefit of both the learners themselves and for everyone in the community. By focusing on what learners can do, we send a powerful message that students from diverse linguistic, cultural, and experiential backgrounds contribute to the vibrancy of our early childhood programs and K-12 schools. And I think this really gets at asset-based instruction, and we have a whole series of learning based on just that. But really, it's this idea of shifting not away from a deficit. We're not trying to fill a gap here. We're trying to leverage what they know, and they come with learning, and they come with background knowledge. It just happens to differ from what is happening in their school system currently. So where we're going to start with this is the can-do descriptors for the key uses, right? So narrate, argue, inform, and explain are these macro functions or genre families that exist in all content areas. These are really functions, right, or ways we use language or purposes, and we call them key uses. So they were first introduced within this series of can-do descriptors for each of these 1 through 6 proficiency levels. And these descriptors describe what a student can do in the area of explain, for example, at a level 1. What can they do at a level 2? And the idea here too is that this language, if we come back to our guiding question, like what role does language play in my classroom? These, through research and analyses of language, these 4 areas have been identified as existing across content areas. And some appear more in certain content areas than others. You can imagine that narrate is really common in English language arts, whereas inform may appear more prominently in the sciences, right? Or mathematics, right? Explain certainly is a big, big piece of mathematics. It's also argue may be, really prominent in social studies. So, and they cross all the content areas, but they had in the 2020 framework, they actually point out their prominence in each of these content areas, which is nice. And so this slide, I'm not going to read through it for you, but you have it for your reference. So as we go, as you go through, you can really kind of get to know these genres, and they give example tasks in sort of where they align to in different content areas. So here's what the can-do descriptors look like. So for key uses, I actually happen to have this little book here. Sometimes they come in book format. They also come in online. I have linked them for you. And they break down just like on our screen, right? They're going to break down by grade level cluster. So this is the 2-3 cluster, and then by key use and proficiency level. So this is grades 2-3, the key use of explain, and what happens in listening. Okay, and then they have that for speaking, for reading, and for writing. And then they have these for every grade level cluster. So you can find the ones appropriate for who you teach. We're going to dive into this in just a second. Okay, so this will be our kind of last hurrah for the day. What I want us to do is really just look at one sample of these key uses within the context of a classroom lesson to get a sense of how you might begin thinking about. Remember, we're not actually doing it today because I knew 1 hour is just not possible to make that happen, but I just want you to think towards that end. So here's what we're going to do in breakout rooms. Now on your sheet, you have this explanation of this third grade lesson, right? So third grade science lesson on adaptations, the teacher provides a National Geographic article, which is linked, and the teacher's going to read this article aloud while students read along. And then in order to have the students process this reading, right, which falls under the key use of explain, it's an explanatory article, right? It's explaining adaptation. So in order to process that, the teacher is going to have them sort some cards by either main idea or detail. And this is what the lesson looks like. And the students are going to work in small groups to sort these cards. And you'll see these all on your sheet. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at this, read the article. You can just briefly read it, you know, and just kind of scan it. And then with your group, I want you to look at the can-do key use for explain in grades 2 and 3. So pull that up and decide together what level, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, does it have 6 in there? They do include 6. So which level does this lesson align to, right? So if this teacher had used these in his or her planning, which level does it align to? Why do you say that? Pull something out of there. And then how could you make this article more accessible for a student at a different level, right? So just feel free to have this open conversation. Really, the point of this is to kind of roll your sleeves up a little and dig in here. No right or wrong answers, okay? All right, so we're gonna go back into breakout groups just for a few minutes to kind of see how this aligns to can do, explain grades 2, 3.
Where's the article?
It's all linked in the document.
In the chat. Oh,
I put it in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Under can do descriptors, there's the article.
Okay.
And then
I see.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Where's it?
Okay.
Here you go.
All right, welcome back. Okay, so briefly, where did you think this activity aligned to in that set of can-dos?
Level 4? Is that what you're, because we found it says like identifying the main idea, but it said for illustrated text and there's only one picture.
Yeah, there's not a lot of illustrated text. So I think, yeah, it's somewhere between I would probably put it at a high, so there's those decimal points, right? Like that high 4, maybe pushing towards a level 5. And it really forces you to think about the level of support that's needed for English learners. I like to think about the fact that an English learner at the federal level is defined as cannot perform ordinary classroom work in English. In other words, if we're not creating all these scaffolds and supports, it's expected that they can't do it, right? So really all these pieces are necessary. And then quickly, does anyone have a sense of how you could make this more accessible? What is something that could be done to scaffold this learning?
I noticed that there are texts at other levels, right? So you could read about the same topic, but at a different level.
Yeah, isn't that a nice feature? You could actually provide those texts in different book styles. Mm-hmm.
Well,
And
and a level 1 scaffold could be that students are given the list of words and locate and identify those words within the text.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're not trusting those access results, you could actually provide that level 1 scaffold. If they don't need it, they're not going to use it, right? But if they need to rely on it, it's there. And that's really great. And then build into the next. So don't be, and then also you can push them into a higher level, right? So don't be afraid to go to the left or the right to see what the just right fit is and provide options. And as we pointed out, Tuesday may be a better day than Wednesday for some students, right? That's just kind of the way it happens. So I'm gonna quickly kind of speed through this next piece just because we're running low on time, but I want you to just think about, you know, how we could use these scores to inform planning. And the first place to start, a really easy entry point, is to find those can-dos for the key uses, identify the key use of the content area, and then look to see what those suggested scaffolds might be, right? So knowing from the individual SPOL report over to those relative strengths and weaknesses between domains, right? Identify that key use, or is it argue, is it inform, is it explain, right? And then evaluate against, just like you did, those can-do descriptors, and make adjustments. And there's a lot of trial and error, which is absolutely okay here. So what I want you to do, you can do this after we log off, is go back to these personal reflections that we did earlier, right? And I want you to look at your guiding questions and then revisit, right? And see if you have any different thoughts on those. And just before we wrap, I want to say like a real brief piece that will take us into some future work that we're planning with demonstrated success around the roles, right, of content classroom teachers and ESOL teachers, and how we can really dovetail those pieces, because there's a lot of different work that works together and kind of gears together to move students forward, and how each of us might use the data differently, right? So a lot of times content classroom teachers can use those can-dos to drive content. Whereas in the ELD classroom, where the language is the content, the teachers may be looking more towards that continuum of language, right? That natural trajectory of academic language that we talked about early on, through those WIDA rubrics, which I have linked for you. So if you want to kind of dig into those in your time, please do. But they are able to kind of look at those and say, what's next in terms of academic language, and how can I support that? And the other piece that I think is really important is to note is that any student's work that happens in ESOL class or English language development is going to benefit them in future content classes, right? It's not a today thing. That's work that's going to, as they acquire that language, will benefit them later. So right now in the content class is where we need to look to those can-dos. So there's a little give and take between these roles. And these rubrics are linked in here, but they're also linked in that sheet that I provided. So yeah, so that's really the overall kind of intro here to using access data, where how did we do? Can we interpret these access reports? Do we have a better understanding of what these pieces look like? I hope that's a yes. And do you feel like you have a sense of how you can use access data to kind of design effective instruction? You don't have to do it yet, but do you know where you're going with that? Awesome. All right, so does anyone have any questions?
I just want to reiterate to everyone that you will get a copy of the slides along with your professional development certificate tomorrow, not until about this time, tomorrow late afternoon. And I will include a link to our YouTube channel, which you can always Google and find it. This webinar will be available, but again, probably not until late tomorrow afternoon. So you can share it, rewatch it, whatever you'd like. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to me. I can get you connected to Dana. Feel free to reach out directly to Dana. I also did, just in the chat, put in 2 other upcoming webinars that you might be interested in. One is April 6th for you, your staff, your colleagues, families, healthy technology use in our children. It's a parent panel as well, and that one is hosted in the evening. And then just for you folks and staff, we have writing IEP goals that align with Common Core practices. So feel free to sign up at any time, share this information. We also have an MTSS webinar series that's also free, and that's the next one is offered this Monday afternoon. So if you're interested in any or all, feel free to reach out. But really, we'd also like to ask you to fill out that survey for us. It takes about a minute, but we value your input. So if you think of something down the road that you want us to know, that you either think we should be hosting a webinar on, you have a question, or you thought, this was really useful for me, we appreciate all of your feedback. So
yeah, I would love to see any feedback. And if you like this as a jumping point into kind of getting deeper and spending more time, let us know. I also want you to know that your data, you may know this date and have it internalized already, but May 18th is when online access reports are coming to the state of New Hampshire. So yeah, so those are accessed through WIDA AMS. If you don't have access to that, your ELL coordinator will, and you can start looking at your own students' most current data at that point.
Super. Thank you so much, Dana. If anyone wants to unmute and make any conversation or points or questions, feel free.
We'd love it.
And if not, go enjoy your day. Thank you all so much for your time. I've always had a hard job. It's certainly been harder the past year or two, and we appreciate everything you're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate all the great questions. What a dedicated bunch. Thank you.
I really appreciate the training from Demonstrated Success. I've been able to get a lot of PD this way, and it kind of makes me feel, you know, hopeful, and it's always good to keep learning, you know, like I think we all probably got into education because we enjoy learning. So it's nice that you offer this to us, and it's not a stressor because it's free and it's virtual and we can just jump on. And so thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. If you don't ever mind putting that in writing on your comments, and
I can do that. I will absolutely do that.
But feel free to use that YouTube channel, because you might find some other webinars that you can find useful, and then just write to me and I'll send you a PD certificate for it and all the resources that go with it. So don't feel alone. You've got a group of people here. We can help. Thank you. Very kind.
And reach out anytime. I'm happy to answer any questions as they come up.
Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate you hosting this. This is really great. I mean, as the only ELL teacher in person in my district, it was, you know, I just landed in here and had to figure out the report. So I actually didn't really know much about the scale part. So that was really informative to learn more about that.
Oh, that's great. You know, it's hard when you don't have that big team.
Yeah.
We can get you connected to Dana at any time. She's so resourceful and intelligent and easy to work with. So good. All right. Go enjoy your day. You guys have had one.
Take care. Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye.